Welcome to the channel The Black Liturgy. Today's story is from 1850. Mercy Whitfield. She was a black girl who crossed the river 14 times. The night was merciless, the current was strong, and each time she came back carrying giants. This is a heavy story. Listen carefully. Take a breath. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your presence keeps these stories alive instead of forgotten. Clears throat, let's begin. Along the frozen banks of the Ohio River in the winter of 1850, something impossible was happening. Under skies so dark you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, night after night. Men were vanishing from the Kentucky side and reappearing in Ohio. Strong men, big men, field workers with shoulders wide enough to carry 200 pounds of cotton, men who feared water more than they feared the whip, men who had never learned to swim. And every single one of them was being led by a child. Her name was Mercy Whitfield. She was 11 years old. She weighed 63 pounds. And she would become one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad that history never recorded. This is her story. In 1850, the Ohio River was not just a body of water. It was a border between two worlds. On the southern side sat Kentucky, a slave state where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. On the northern side, Ohio, a free state where that same human being could walk down the street without chains. The distance between slavery and freedom was sometimes less than 1,000 feet, but those 1,000 feet of dark, cold, rushing water might as well have been an ocean. The river was unpredictable. In some places, it ran shallow enough to wade across. In others, the current could pull a grown man under in seconds. Littering the bottom was debris, sharp rocks, fallen trees, and the bones of those who had tried to cross and failed. Local fishermen knew its dangers. They respected it. Many of them refused to work its waters after sunset. But for enslaved people desperate for freedom, the Ohio River was the only path. And in 1850, that path became more dangerous than ever. On September 18th of that year, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law changed everything. Before 1850, if an enslaved person managed to reach a free state, they had a reasonable chance of starting a new life. The law was complicated. Enforcement was inconsistent. Many northern communities refused to cooperate with slave catchers. The Fugitive Slave Act destroyed all of that. Under this new law, federal commissioners were appointed in every county to handle cases of accused runaways. These commissioners received $10 for every person they returned to slavery, but only $5 if they set them free. The financial incentive was clear. The law also required ordinary citizens to assist in the capture of runaways. Anyone who refused could be fined $1,000 and imprisoned for 6 months. Anyone who helped a runaway could face even harsher penalties. Overnight, the entire North became a hunting ground. Professional slave catchers flooded across the Ohio River. They set up camps along the banks. They paid informants in free black communities. They watched the roads, the bridges, the ferry crossings. They knew that desperate people would try desperate things, and they were ready. In Ripley, Ohio, a small town directly across the river from Kentucky, the slave catchers were especially active. Ripley had a reputation. It was known as one of the most important stations on the Underground Railroad. The town sat on a bluff overlooking the river, and at the top of that bluff stood a house with a lantern that burned every night. That lantern was a signal. It told runaways on the Kentucky side that help was waiting. The slave catchers knew about the lantern. They watched it. They counted the people who went up the hill. They waited, but they never watched the water itself. Not the way they should have. 3 mi downriver from Ripley, where the Ohio curved sharply to the west, there was a stretch of water that local people called the Devil's Elbow. The current there was strange. It pushed against itself, creating eddies and whirlpools that could spin a boat in circles. The banks were thick with willow trees whose roots reached down into the water like fingers. During spring floods, debris piled up against those roots, creating underwater barriers that could trap a swimmer and hold them down until they drowned. Nobody crossed at the Devil's Elbow. It was too dangerous. The slave catchers didn't even bother to patrol it. That was their mistake. Because there was one person who knew the Devil's Elbow better than anyone alive. That was their mistake because there was one person who knew the Devil's Elbow better than anyone alive. One person who had spent years studying its currents, memorizing its hidden paths, learning which rocks were stable and which would shift under your weight. One person who could navigate its darkness by feel alone. That person was an 11-year-old girl named Mercy. Mercy Whitfield was born in 1839 on a tobacco plantation 12 miles south of the river. The plantation was owned by a man named Cornelius Whitfield, a third-generation Kentucky farmer whose family had been growing tobacco since before the Revolution. The Whitfield plantation wasn't the largest in the region, but it was prosperous. Cornelius owned 47 enslaved people, and he ran his operation with what he considered efficiency. Mercy never knew her mother. The woman died giving birth to her, a hemorrhage that no one tried very hard to stop. Mercy's father was sold 8 months before she was born, sent to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. She would never learn his name. In the world of American slavery, this was not unusual. Families were broken apart constantly. Children were separated from parents, husbands from wives, siblings from each other. The law did not recognize slave marriages. The law did not recognize slave families. The law recognized only property. Mercy was raised by a man named Moses. He was 62 years old when she was born, ancient by the standards of enslaved field workers. Moses had survived longer than anyone on the Whitfield plantation. He had outlived 3 owners, 2 wives, and 7 of his own children. He walked with a permanent limp from a beating he received in 1819. His left eye was clouded with cataracts. His hands were twisted with arthritis. But Moses had one thing that made him valuable. He knew how to work the drying barns. Tobacco curing was an art. The temperature had to be exactly right. The humidity had to be controlled. One mistake could ruin an entire harvest. Cornelius Whitfield could not afford to lose Moses. So Moses survived. And Moses, for reasons he never fully explained, decided to raise Mercy as his own. From the time she could walk, Mercy followed Moses everywhere. She learned to read the tobacco leaves to judge when they were ready for cutting. She learned to tend the fires in the curing barns to keep them burning low and steady through the night. And she learned something else, something that Moses taught her in whispers when no one else was listening. She learned the river. Moses had grown up near the Ohio on a plantation just 3 miles from its banks. As a young man, before his leg was broken, he had been a skilled swimmer. He had crossed the river twice himself, trying to escape. Both times he was caught. Both times he was beaten and returned. But he never forgot what he learned. The river had patterns. The current moved differently in different seasons. The bottom shifted, but not randomly. There were paths through the water, places where a person could walk if they knew where to step. Moses had mapped those paths in his mind over 40 years of watching, and he passed that map to Mercy. Why did he teach her? Perhaps he saw something in her that reminded him of himself. Perhaps he wanted his knowledge to survive even if his body didn't. Perhaps he simply loved her. And love makes people do things that logic cannot explain. Whatever the reason, by the time Mercy was 9 years old, she knew the Devil's Elbow better than she knew the plantation where she lived. She would sneak away at night, moving through the tobacco fields like a shadow. She would reach the river and wade into its waters, feeling the current against her legs. She learned which rocks were safe. She learned where the bottom dropped away. She learned how to read the surface of the water, to see the ripples that meant danger and the smooth patches that meant safety. The cold didn't bother her. Her body was small, but it was tough. Years of work had hardened her in ways that most children never experience. She could hold her breath for nearly 2 minutes. She could float on her back for hours. She could move through water without making a sound. By the time she was 10, Mercy had crossed the river alone. She didn't run away. That wasn't the point. She crossed to prove she could do it. Then she crossed back. She stood on the Kentucky bank in the darkness, water dripping from her thin dress, and she smiled. She had found something that belonged only to her. The year 1850 changed everything. The Fugitive Slave Act arrived in September, and by October, the Whitfield plantation was buzzing with news. Cornelius Whitfield read the new law with satisfaction. He had lost 3 enslaved people to runaways over the past decade, and he had never recovered any of them. Now, he believed the tide was turning. His son, Thomas Jr., was even more enthusiastic. Thomas was 19 years old and he had grown up watching his father run the plantation. He was eager to prove himself. He was also cruel in ways that his father was not. Cornelius Whitfield used violence as a tool. He beat enslaved people when he believed it was necessary for discipline. He didn't enjoy it particularly. It was simply part of the business. Thomas was different. Thomas enjoyed it. He sought out reasons to punish people. He invented infractions. He lingered over the whippings, watching the skin split, listening to the screams. The enslaved people on the Whitfield plantation had learned to fear Thomas even more than they feared his father. In November of 1850, Thomas made an announcement. He had heard rumors that some of the enslaved people were planning to run. He didn't know who. He didn't have proof. But he intended to send a message. He chose Moses. The official reason was theft. Thomas claimed that Moses had stolen food from the main house. It was a lie. Everyone knew it was a lie. Moses hadn't left the curing barns in weeks. But the truth didn't matter. What mattered was the message. They tied Moses to a post in the yard where everyone could see. Thomas administered the beating himself. He used a whip with a braided leather tip, the kind that cut deep. He gave Moses 30 lashes. For a younger man, it would have been agony, but survivable. For a 62-year-old man with arthritis and a bad leg, it was nearly fatal. Moses survived, but barely. He spent 3 weeks in his cabin, too weak to move. Mercy cared for him, bringing water and food, cleaning his wounds with rags soaked in salt water. She sat beside him at night and listened to his breathing, terrified that each breath would be his last. During those 3 weeks, Cornelius Whitfield made a decision. Moses was no longer productive. The beating had broken something in him. He would never work the curing barns again. And a slave who couldn't work was a slave who needed to be sold. Cornelius found a buyer in Mississippi. A cotton planter named Richardson, who was always looking for cheap labor. Richardson didn't care that Moses was old and broken. He would work Moses until he died, and then he would buy another one. That was how the cotton plantations operated. The sale was scheduled for December 15th. Mercy learned about it on December 8th. She overheard 2 of the house servants talking. Moses had 7 days. That night, Mercy made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to save him. The plan was simple because it had to be. Mercy had no resources, no allies, no experience. She had only her knowledge of the river and her determination to use it. Moses couldn't walk well. He certainly couldn't run. He couldn't swim. He couldn't fight. He was in every practical sense helpless. But Mercy had spent 2 years studying the devil's elbow. And she knew something that no one else knew. At the sharpest point of the curve, where the current pushed hardest against the western bank, there was a sandbar. It sat about 3 feet below the surface, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And that sandbar created a path. The path was narrow. In some places, it was only 18 in wide. A grown man would have to walk carefully, placing each foot exactly right. One wrong step, and the current would sweep him away. But if he followed the path exactly, if he trusted the person guiding him, he could cross the river without swimming a single stroke. The water would never rise above his chest. Mercy had walked that path dozens of times. She knew every inch of it. She knew where the sandbar dipped and where it rose. She knew where the rocks jutted up and where the mud would try to suck your feet down. She could walk it blindfolded. The question was whether Moses could walk it at all. On the night of December 12, 3 days before he was scheduled to be sold, Mercy put her plan into action. She waited until the plantation was asleep. The main house went dark around 10 o'clock. The overseer's cabin followed an hour later. By midnight, the only sounds were the wind in the tobacco fields and the distant barking of dogs. Mercy crept to Moses's cabin. She found him awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at nothing. His back was still covered with scabs from the beating. His hands shook constantly now, a tremor that he couldn't control. She didn't explain what she was doing. There wasn't time for explanations. She simply took his hand and led him outside. They moved slowly. Moses couldn't walk fast, even on his best days, and this was not his best day. Every step seemed to cost him something. His breathing was ragged. His limp was worse than ever. It took them 2 hours to cover the 3 mi to the river. When they reached the bank of the Devil's Elbow, Moses stopped. He looked at the water, black and rushing in the darkness, and Mercy saw something she had never seen in him before. Fear. Moses had crossed this river twice in his youth, and twice he had been caught and beaten. The river meant pain to him. The river meant failure. Looking at it now, old and broken, he couldn't imagine crossing it again. Mercy squeezed his hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply stepped into the water and pulled him with her. The cold hit them immediately. December water in the Ohio River hovers just above freezing. It steals heat from your body faster than air ever could. Most people stepping into water this cold would gasp, panic, lose control. Mercy had trained herself not to react. She kept her breathing steady. She kept moving. Moses stumbled behind her, his bad legs struggling to find purchase on the riverbed. The current pushed against him, trying to knock him over. He was bigger than Mercy, heavier, and the water affected him more strongly. Mercy positioned herself upstream, using her body to break the current. It wasn't much, 63 pounds, against the force of a river, but it helped. It gave Moses a slightly easier path. They reached the sandbar. Here, the water dropped from chest height to waist height. Moses could stand more easily, but the path was narrow and the darkness was absolute. He couldn't see where to step. Mercy guided him with her hands. She placed his feet on the sandbar one at a time, showing him where the solid ground was. She moved backward, facing him, walking the path from memory while keeping her attention on his every movement. It took 45 minutes to cross. When they reached the Ohio side, Moses collapsed on the bank. He was shaking violently, his body struggling to generate heat. Mercy pulled him into the shelter of the willow trees and covered him with leaves and branches, anything to hold in warmth. She sat beside him as the sky began to lighten. They had done it. They had crossed the river. Moses was in a free state. But freedom in 1850 was not the same as safety. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could pursue runaways anywhere. Moses needed to keep moving. He needed to reach Canada, the only place where American law couldn't touch him. Mercy knew she couldn't take him that far. She was 11 years old and she had to get back to the plantation before dawn. If she was discovered missing, there would be questions. If the connection was made between her disappearance and Moses's escape, there would be consequences. So, she did the only thing she could do. She pointed Moses toward Ripley, told him to look for the lantern on the hill, and then she slipped back into the river. The return crossing was harder. She was exhausted. The cold had sapped her strength. The current seemed stronger going back than it had going out. But she made it. She crawled out of the water on the Kentucky side just as the first light touched the horizon. She was shaking so badly she could barely walk. Her fingers had turned white. Her lips were blue. She made it back to the slave quarters and collapsed on her cot, pulling her thin blanket over her wet clothes. When the overseer came through at dawn to wake the workers, Mercy was lying in her bed, apparently asleep. No one suspected anything. 3 days later, when Cornelius Whitfield discovered that Moses was gone, he was furious. He sent riders out in every direction. He hired slave catchers. He offered a reward of $200, a significant sum in 1850. They never found Moses. Months later, Mercy heard through the whispered network of enslaved communication that Moses had made it to Canada. He was living in a small town called St. Catharines, working as a carpenter's assistant. He was free. Mercy had done the impossible. She had guided a broken old man across one of the most dangerous rivers in America in the middle of winter in total darkness. And she realized she could do it again. Word spread quietly through the Whitfield plantation and beyond. There was a way across the river. There was a path that the slave catchers didn't know about. There was someone who could guide you. Nobody knew that the guide was an 11-year-old girl. The people who came to her saw only a child. They didn't expect anything. That was part of what made it work. The second crossing came in January. His name was Samuel. He was 28 years old, 6 feet 4 inches in tall, and he weighed 240 pounds. He worked in the tobacco fields alongside 30 other men, and he had hands large enough to wrap entirely around a fence post. Samuel had tried to escape twice before. Both times he had tried to cross the river by swimming. Both times the current had overwhelmed him. He nearly drowned the second time, pulled from the water by slave catchers who beat him unconscious, and returned him to his owner. Samuel was terrified of water. The very sight of the river made him shake, but he was more terrified of spending the rest of his life in chains. When he heard about the path at the Devil's Elbow, he sought out the person who knew it. He found Mercy. At first, he didn't believe it. He looked at this small girl, this child, and he couldn't imagine that she held his freedom in her hands. But Mercy spoke with a certainty that made him listen. She described the path in detail. She explained how the current moved, where the sandbar lay, how deep the water would be at each point. She spoke like someone who had done this before because she had. They crossed on a night with no moon. The darkness was so complete that Samuel couldn't see Mercy standing right in front of him. He could only feel her hand holding his, pulling him forward. He was shaking before they even reached the water. When his feet touched the cold current, he almost turned back. Everything in his body screamed at him to run away from the river, not into it. But Mercy held his hand, and she didn't let go. Step by step, she guided him across. When the water reached his chest, she felt his grip tighten in panic. She squeezed back, steady and calm. She kept moving. She didn't hesitate. Samuel was bigger than Moses, heavier, harder to guide. The current pushed against him like a living thing. Twice he stumbled. Twice Mercy caught him, her small hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. It took over an hour to cross. When Samuel reached the other side, he fell to his knees and wept. He was a giant of a man, and he had been guided to freedom by a child who barely reached his waist. He tried to thank her, but Mercy was already slipping back into the water. She had to return before dawn. There was no time for gratitude. Samuel made it to Canada 6 weeks later. He settled in Toronto, found work in a lumberyard, and eventually married a woman from Jamaica who had escaped slavery in the Caribbean. They had 4 children. He never forgot the girl who saved him. The third crossing happened in February, the fourth in March. By April, Mercy had guided 6 men across the Devil's Elbow. Each crossing was different. Each man had his own fears, his own weaknesses, his own reasons for running. Some were young and strong. Some were old and broken. Some were running toward something. Family members in the north, promises of work, dreams of freedom. Others were running away, escaping brutal masters, avoiding sail to the deep south, fleeing punishment for crimes they didn't commit. Mercy treated them all the same. She held their hands. She guided their feet. She led them through the darkness to the other side. And she never got caught. Part of her success was the location. The Devil's Elbow was genuinely dangerous, and the slave catchers genuinely avoided it. They focused their attention on the easier crossings, the places where the river was wider but calmer. They never imagined that anyone would deliberately choose the most treacherous stretch of water on the entire border. Part of her success was her size. Mercy was a child. She was invisible in ways that adults were not. She could move through the night without attracting attention. She could slip away from the plantation and return without anyone noticing. The overseers saw her as harmless. The other enslaved people saw her as just another child. Nobody saw her as a threat. And part of her success was her skill. Mercy had spent years learning the river. She knew it in ways that no one else did. She could feel changes in the current through her feet. She could hear the difference between safe water and dangerous water. She could navigate in total darkness using only her memory and her instincts. She was in her own quiet way a genius. By the summer of 1851, Mercy had completed 10 crossings. 10 men had walked the path through the Devil's Elbow. 10 men had reached the Ohio side. 10 men had found their way to freedom. The Whitfield plantation was in chaos. Cornelius Whitfield couldn't understand what was happening. He had lost 8 enslaved people in a single year, an unprecedented number. The losses were devastating financially. More than that, they were devastating to his sense of control. He hired more overseers. He increased patrols. He built a new fence around the slave quarters. He threatened collective punishment if anyone else escaped. Nothing worked. The escapes continued. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had his own theory. He believed that someone on the plantation was helping the runaways. Someone who knew the roads, the schedules, the patrol patterns, someone on the inside. He began watching. He interrogated enslaved people one by one, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. He punished anyone who seemed suspicious. He created an atmosphere of terror. And still he never suspected Mercy. Why would he? She was a child. She was small. She was quiet. She did her work without complaint. She never talked back. She never drew attention to herself. She was invisible. The 11th crossing happened in August of 1851. His name was Gabriel, and he was different from the others. Gabriel was a preacher. He had taught himself to read using a stolen Bible. And he held secret services in the woods behind the plantation where he lived. He preached about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He preached about the Promised Land. He preached about freedom. His master discovered the services and decided to make an example of him. Gabriel was scheduled to be publicly whipped. 50 lashes, enough to kill a weaker man. The night before the punishment, he ran. He found his way to the Devil's Elbow through a network of whispers and rumors. When he met Mercy, he fell to his knees and prayed. He prayed for her. He prayed for her strength, her courage, her wisdom. He prayed that God would protect her, guide her, keep her safe. Mercy stood there uncomfortable, not sure how to respond. She wasn't religious. She had seen too much suffering to believe in a God who cared about enslaved people. But Gabriel's faith was genuine, and she could not dismiss it. They crossed that night. The water was warmer in August, but the current was stronger. Summer storms had swelled the river, changing its patterns. The sandbar had shifted slightly, and Mercy had to adjust her path. Gabriel followed her with absolute trust. He believed that God had sent this child to save him, and he was not about to question God's methods. When they reached the other side, Gabriel blessed her. He placed his hands on her head and spoke words that Mercy didn't fully understand. Words about grace and mercy and divine purpose. Then he disappeared into the darkness, heading north toward the lantern on the hill. Gabriel made it to Canada. He continued preaching, establishing a small church in a town called Dresden. He never named Mercy in his sermons, but he spoke often about the child who had led him through the waters. He called her an angel. He wasn't the only one. As the summer turned to fall and fall turned to winter, the legend grew. Throughout the slave communities of Kentucky, people whispered about the devil's elbow. They whispered about the path through the darkness. They whispered about the guide. Some said the guide was a ghost. Some said it was a spirit of the river itself. Some said it was an angel sent by God to lead his people to freedom. Nobody said it was an 11-year-old girl. The 12th crossing happened in November, the 13th in December. By January of 1852, Mercy had guided 14 men across the river. 14 crossings, 14 giants, 14 acts of impossible courage, and then everything changed. The winter of 1852 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time. The Ohio River, which usually resisted freezing because of its current, began to develop ice along its banks. The Devil's Elbow became even more dangerous. The cold water sapping strength faster than ever. Ice chunks floating in the current like knives. Mercy knew she should stop. The conditions were too dangerous. Even her knowledge of the river couldn't protect against water this cold. But people kept coming. They came because they were desperate. They came because they had no other choice. They came because they had heard about the path through the Devil's Elbow and they believed it was their only hope. Mercy couldn't turn them away. In February of 1852, she agreed to guide a man named Isaac. He was 34 years old, a blacksmith from a plantation near Louisville. He had powerful arms and clever hands, and his owner had promised to sell him to a plantation in Alabama where he would never see his family again. Isaac had a wife and 2 children. They were still enslaved on a different plantation, but he had hopes of earning enough money in the North to buy their freedom. It was a desperate hope, almost certainly impossible, but it was all he had. Mercy agreed to guide him. They set out on a night when the temperature was 8 degrees below zero. The wind was blowing from the northwest, carrying sheets of ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Mercy had wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she could find. But she was still shivering before they even reached the river. The Devil's Elbow was transformed. Ice had built up along the banks, extending 15 feet into the water. The current had shifted, pushing harder against the eastern side. The sandbar, Mercy discovered when she stepped into the water, had moved again. She had to find the path by feel. Isaac followed her, his teeth chattering so loudly she could hear them over the wind. He was bigger than her, stronger, but the cold affected him more. His movements became sluggish. His grip on her hand weakened. Halfway across, he stumbled. The current caught him immediately, spinning him away from the sandbar into deeper water. Mercy lunged after him, grabbing his arm, but his weight was too much. He was pulling her down with him. For a terrible moment, Mercy thought they were both going to die. But Isaac found his footing. Some instinct, some desperate surge of strength allowed him to plant his feet on a rock she hadn't known was there. He pushed himself upright, gasping. Mercy guided him back to the sandbar. Her hands were numb. Her legs were shaking. She could barely feel the path beneath her feet. But she kept moving. They reached the Ohio side just as Mercy's body began to fail. Her muscles were cramping. Her vision was blurring. The cold had stolen too much from her. She collapsed on the bank, unable to move. Isaac lifted her. He carried her to the shelter of the trees and held her against his chest, trying to share his body heat. He rubbed her arms and legs, forcing blood to circulate. He spoke to her constantly, words of encouragement and gratitude and desperate hope. Slowly, painfully, Mercy's body began to warm. She had survived, but barely. That night, lying in the arms of a man she had just saved, Mercy made a decision. She was done. 14 crossings were enough. She had pushed her luck too far. The next time, she might not survive. She told Isaac to head for the lantern on the hill. She watched him disappear into the darkness. Then she slipped back into the river for what she believed would be the last time. The return crossing nearly killed her. The cold had sapped her strength more than she realized. The current had grown stronger. The ice had built up further. Twice she lost the path. Twice she had to stop and feel her way forward, her numb feet searching for solid ground. She reached the Kentucky side as dawn was breaking. She crawled out of the water and lay on the frozen bank, too exhausted to move. The cold seeped into her bones. She could feel her heartbeat slowing. She thought about Moses. She thought about Samuel. She thought about all the men she had guided across the river. She thought about freedom. And then she closed her eyes. She woke 3 hours later, covered in frost, barely alive. Somehow she dragged herself back to the plantation. Somehow she made it to her cabin without being seen. Somehow she collapsed onto her cot and pulled her blanket over her body. She slept for 2 days. When she finally woke, she knew that something had changed. Her body was weaker. Her lungs hurt when she breathed. Her fingers and toes tingled constantly. The first signs of frostbite damage that would never fully heal. She had given everything she had to those 14 crossings. And she believed, truly believed, that her work was done. She was wrong. 3 months passed. Spring came to Kentucky, melting the ice, warming the river, bringing new life to the tobacco fields. Mercy recovered slowly. Her lungs healed. Her strength returned. The tingling in her fingers and toes faded to a dull ache that she learned to ignore. She went back to work. She tended the curing barns. She followed the routines that had defined her life before she discovered the river. She tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Every night she dreamed of the water. She dreamed of the current pulling at her legs, the darkness pressing against her eyes, the hands of desperate men gripping hers. She dreamed of the path through the devil's elbow, every rock and ridge memorized, every twist and turn burned into her mind. She dreamed of freedom, and every night she woke up still enslaved. The Whitfield plantation had changed during those 3 months. Cornelius Whitfield's health was failing. He spent most of his time in bed coughing blood into handkerchiefs that the house servants burned in secret. The doctors came and went, but their medicines did nothing. Something was eating him from the inside. Thomas Jr. had taken over the daily operations of the plantation. He walked the fields with a whip coiled at his belt. He watched the enslaved workers with suspicious eyes. He punished infractions that his father would have ignored. The atmosphere grew darker. People whispered that Thomas was looking for someone to blame for the escapes. 14 men had vanished in less than 2 years. Someone had helped them. Someone knew the way. Thomas intended to find that someone. In May of 1852, he made his move. The target was a woman named Ruth. She was 43 years old, a house servant who had worked for the Whitfield family her entire life. Ruth had never tried to escape. She had never shown any interest in running, but she had one characteristic that made Thomas suspicious. Ruth could read. She had learned as a child, taught by Cornelius Whitfield's mother, who believed that house servants should be educated enough to follow written instructions. Ruth had never used her literacy for anything subversive. She read recipes. She read labels on medicine bottles. She kept inventory lists for the kitchen. But Thomas knew that literacy was dangerous. An enslaved person who could read could communicate in ways that overseers couldn't monitor. They could pass written messages. They could create maps. They could document routes and schedules. Thomas convinced himself that Ruth was the key to the escapes. He interrogated her for 3 days. He asked about the missing men. He asked about the river. He asked about the Underground Railroad. Ruth knew nothing. She had nothing to tell him. But Thomas didn't believe her. On the 3rd day, he brought out the whip. Mercy watched from the doorway of the curing barn. She was too far away to hear what was being said, but she could see everything. She saw Thomas raise the whip. She saw Ruth fall to her knees. She saw the first stroke land across her shoulders. Ruth screamed. The sound carried across the plantation sharp and terrible. It was the sound of innocence being punished, of cruelty exercising its power simply because it could. Thomas whipped Ruth 30 times. When he was finished, she lay in the dirt, barely breathing. Her dress was soaked with blood. Her back was a ruin of torn flesh. Thomas stood over her, coiling his whip, and announced to everyone watching that this was what happened to people who helped runaways. He didn't care if Ruth was innocent. He wanted to send a message. The message was received. That night, Mercy lay in her cabin and stared at the ceiling. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw was clenched so tight, her teeth ached. Ruth had done nothing. Ruth had helped no one. Ruth had been beaten nearly to death for crimes that Mercy had committed. The guilt was overwhelming. But beneath the guilt, something else was growing, something harder, something colder, something that felt like fire and ice at the same time. Mercy had spent 2 years helping people escape. She had risked her life 14 times. She had guided giants through the darkness asking nothing in return. And now an innocent woman was lying in a cabin bleeding because of her? Thomas Whitfield Jr. had done this. Thomas with his whip and his cruelty and his endless suspicion. Thomas who enjoyed causing pain. Thomas who had beaten Moses. Thomas who had beaten Ruth. For the first time in her life, Mercy understood hatred. Not anger, not fear, not resentment, hatred, the kind that burns clean and cold, the kind that doesn't fade with time, the kind that waits. Mercy waited. The summer of 1852 was hot and dry. The tobacco crop struggled. Cornelius Whitfield grew weaker. Thomas grew more powerful. In July, Cornelius died. The funeral was a grand affair by Kentucky standards. Neighbors came from miles around. A minister spoke about Cornelius's faith, his family, his contributions to the community. No one mentioned the 47 human beings he had owned. No one mentioned the families he had destroyed, the lives he had stolen, the suffering he had caused. They buried him in the family cemetery beneath an oak tree that had stood for 100 years. Thomas inherited everything. The change was immediate. Thomas had always been cruel, but he had been constrained by his father's presence. Cornelius was a businessman. He understood that excessive brutality was counterproductive. Dead slaves couldn't work. Crippled slaves worked slowly. Fear was useful, but only in moderation. Thomas had no such understanding. In the weeks following his father's death, Thomas increased punishments dramatically. He whipped people for talking too slowly. He whipped people for looking at him wrong. He whipped people for no reason at all simply because he felt like it. 3 enslaved people died that summer, 2 from beatings, 1 from an infection that Thomas refused to have treated. The plantation became a place of terror. And Mercy watched. She watched and she waited and she planned. She didn't know what she was planning. She didn't have a specific goal. She just knew that something was coming. Something that would change everything. In September, she found out what it was. The news came through the whispered network that connected enslaved communities across Kentucky. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had made a terrible mistake. He had cheated a man named Harrison Cole. Harrison Cole was a slave catcher. He was one of the most successful in the region with a reputation for ruthlessness that even other slave catchers found disturbing. He had worked for the Whitfield family several times, tracking down runaways, collecting bounties. Thomas had hired Cole to capture a runaway from a neighboring plantation. Cole had succeeded, returning the man in chains. But when it came time to pay, Thomas had refused. He claimed the bounty was too high. He claimed Cole had taken too long. He offered half.